Stoicism doesn't deny that. It simply refuses to sacrifice integrity for inclusion. The Stoic chooses solitude over corruption, not permanent solitude, selective solitude, enough to maintain clarity, enough to hear himself think. This clarity reveals something else. Many desires are not about wanting something. They're about avoiding something, avoiding boredom, avoiding silence, avoiding the feeling that your life lacks direction. Stoicism forces you to face that feeling instead of masking it. And when you face it, you realize something critical. Desire was not the problem, lack of purpose was. And purpose doesn't emerge from chasing, it emerges from commitment. Commitment to principles, commitment to effort, commitment to a direction that may not reward you immediately. This is where Stoicism begins to reshape life at a deeper level. You stop asking, "What do I want right now?" You start asking, "What deserves my effort?" That question doesn't have flashy answers, but it has stable ones. And stability is what most people are missing. Once desire is disciplined, energy returns. You're no longer scattered. You're no longer pulled in 10 directions. You move forward, not quickly, but deliberately. And deliberate movement creates momentum. Momentum changes how you experience difficulty. Obstacles stop feeling personal. Setbacks stop feeling humiliating. They become part of the path. This is where Stoicism starts to produce something rare. Inner authority. Not authority over others, authority over yourself. You no longer feel compelled to explain your choices constantly. You don't need validation for restraint. You act according to what you know is right, even when it's unpopular. That's power. Quiet power, but power introduces a new challenge, responsibility. Because once you're no longer driven by desire, you can no longer blame it for your decisions. You chose this path, and choice carries weight. That weight is what most people avoid. Stoicism embraces it. And that brings us to the next block. Because once desire is disciplined, the real test begins. Endurance. Not in moments of excitement, but in moments of monotony. That's where most philosophies fail. Stoicism doesn't. And that's where we go next. Monotony is where most people break. Not failure, not pain, not loss. Repetition. Doing the right thing without novelty, without reward, without feedback. This is where discipline stops being inspiring and starts being real. Stoicism was built for this phase because the Stoics understood something most people don't want to hear. Life is not a series of climaxes. It's mostly routine. And if your character only shows up when things feel meaningful, It's not character, it's mood. Most people collapse into distraction the moment life stops stimulating them. They scroll, they consume, they chase minor pleasures, not because they're evil, but because silence exposes emptiness. Stoicism does not rush to fill that emptiness. It forces you to sit inside it. This is deeply uncomfortable because boredom is not the absence of activity. It's the absence of meaning. And when meaning is missing, the mind looks for substitutes: drama, conflict, endless entertainment. Stoicism refuses substitutes. It says, build meaning through consistency, not through excitement. This is where the Stoic becomes dangerous, because he learns to function without emotional reward. He trains himself to act even when nothing feels special. That ability alone puts him ahead of most people. Most people wait to feel inspired. The Stoic acts because it's required. That distinction changes everything. Inspiration is unreliable. Requirement is stable. When you act only when inspired, progress is accidental. When you act because it's required, progress is inevitable. The Stoics built their lives around what they called duty, not duty imposed by society, duty chosen internally, duty to reason, duty to discipline, duty to character. This wasn't romantic, it was practical. They knew emotions fluctuate, circumstances shift, motivation disappears, but duty remains. Once chosen, it doesn't argue. This is why Stoicism emphasizes routine. Same habits, same standards, regardless of mood, not rigidly, reliably. Routine protects you from your own inconsistency, and inconsistency is the enemy of growth. Most people overestimate what they can do in bursts and underestimate what repetition can build. Stoicism reverses this. It focuses on small actions performed daily without negotiation. This doesn't look impressive. There's no breakthrough moment, no viral transformation, just quiet accumulation. But quiet accumulation is how strength is actually built. The Stoic doesn't aim to feel strong. He aims to become reliable. Reliability under boredom, reliability under fatigue, reliability under silence. That's rare. And rarity creates advantage. This is where Stoicism begins to separate you from the emotional economy of the world. Most systems today depend on your reactivity. News cycles, social platforms, marketing, they feed on attention spikes. Stoicism flattens those spikes. You become harder to provoke, harder to manipulate, harder to distract. This isn't accidental. The Stoic deliberately reduces exposure, not out of fear, out of strategy. If attention is limited, it must be protected, And boredom is a test of attention. If you can endure boredom without escaping it, you gain control over your mind. That control compounds. You stop seeking novelty compulsively. You stop abandoning projects prematurely. You stop chasing stimulation. You finish things. Most people don't finish. They abandon. They abandon when it gets repetitive, when progress slows, when praise disappears. Stoicism prepares you for this exact moment. It teaches you to expect the plateau. Every meaningful pursuit has one: early excitement, rapid improvement, then flatness. Most people quit here. They assume something is wrong. Stoicism says this is normal. The plateau is not failure. It's the transition from enthusiasm to mastery. Mastery is built in boredom. The Stoic knows this. So he doesn't panic when things feel dull. He keeps going. That persistence creates an edge that looks like talent from the outside. But it's not talent. It's tolerance for monotony. And tolerance for monotony is one of the rarest traits today, because modern life trains you to avoid it at all costs. Constant stimulation, endless novelty. The Stoic swims against that current, not loudly, quietly. He structures his environment to reduce temptation. He simplifies choices to preserve energy. He doesn't test his willpower constantly. He conserves it. This is another misunderstood aspect of Stoicism. It's not about brute force discipline. It's about intelligent constraint. Remove friction where possible. Add friction where necessary. Make good choices easier. Make bad choices harder. This is how discipline becomes sustainable. Most people exhaust themselves trying to be strong emotionally. Stoicism bypasses that. It designs life so strength is less frequently required. That's wisdom. But monotony doesn't just test discipline, it tests meaning. When nothing exciting happens, when progress is invisible, you begin to ask dangerous questions. Why am I doing this? Does this matter? Is this worth it? These questions are inevitable. Stoicism doesn't suppress them. It answers them differently, not with passion, with principle. You don't act because it feels meaningful today. You act because it aligns with who you decided to be. That identity doesn't change with mood. This is why Stoicism builds long-term resilience. When external motivation disappears, internal commitment remains, and commitment carries you through phases that destroy others. This is where Stoicism becomes deeply unpopular, because it rejects the modern obsession with feeling good. It says feeling good is optional. Acting well is not. That message creates friction. People want permission to disengage when things stop feeling rewarding. Stoicism denies that permission. Not cruelly, honestly. It says, if you abandon discipline when it's boring, you never had discipline. You had enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is cheap. Endurance is rare. Stoicism trains endurance, not heroic endurance, daily endurance, endurance of repetition, endurance of silence, endurance of effort without recognition. That endurance produces something profound. Self-respect, not the kind that comes from praise, the kind that comes from knowing you didn't quit on yourself. That self-respect is quiet, but it stabilizes you. You stop doubting yourself constantly. You stop second-guessing every choice. You know who you are because your behavior has proven it. And when life introduces real pressure, that proof matters. Because pressure amplifies whatever foundation exists. If your foundation is weak, pressure collapses you. If your foundation is built on repetition, pressure reveals strength. Stoicism prepares you for pressure by training you in monotony. And monotony, properly endured, becomes armor. But pressure doesn't just test discipline, it tests values. When things get hard, what do you protect? Comfort? Image? Integrity? That choice defines character. And that brings us to the next block. Because once monotony is mastered, life raises the stakes. Not with excitement, with consequence. And Stoicism has a brutal answer for that too. Consequence is where philosophy stops being theoretical. Up to this point, discipline can still feel optional. Routine can feel personal. Stoicism can feel like self-improvement. Consequence removes that illusion. Because consequence doesn't care what you meant to do. It only responds to what you did repeatedly. This is the moment most people finally pay attention. Not when advice is given, when reality answers back. Health problems from years of neglect, broken relationships from years of avoidance, career stagnation from years of comfort. Stoicism never waits for this moment. It studies it in advance. The Stoics believe that every action plants a seed. Most people just don't stay long enough to see what grows. They move on. They distract themselves. They blame circumstances. Stoicism doesn't allow that escape. It says, look directly at the result of your habits. Not emotionally, logically. If your life feels unstable, your standards were unstable. If your mind feels chaotic, your inputs were chaotic. If your progress feels stalled, your actions were inconsistent. This isn't punishment, it's cause and effect. Stoicism is obsessed with cause and effect because it returns agency. Once you see consequences clearly, you stop feeling cursed and start feeling responsible. Responsibility is heavy, but it's also empowering. empowering. Because if your actions created this reality, different actions can create a different one. But here's where things get uncomfortable. Most people don't actually want to change consequences. They want to escape them. They want relief without correction, comfort without restructuring, results without discipline. Stoicism denies this completely. It says relief without correction is temporary. Sooner or later, consequence returns stronger. This is why Stoicism is often misunderstood as harsh. It doesn't offer emotional anesthetic. It offers long-term stability. And stability requires sacrifice. Not dramatic sacrifice, daily sacrifice. Sacrificing the urge to avoid, sacrificing the need to explain, sacrificing short-term relief for long-term alignment. Most people underestimate how painful avoidance becomes over time. Avoidance feels good today. It compounds misery tomorrow. Stoicism makes this visible early. It trains you to ask a dangerous question. What am I avoiding? And what is that avoidance costing me? That question doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels exposing. Because the answer is usually clear. The conversation you won't have, the habit you won't drop, the effort you won't sustain, you already know. Stoicism doesn't shame you for this. It simply removes your ability to pretend you don't know. And pretending is the real enemy. Pretending that things will fix themselves. Pretending that time alone heals. Pretending that insight without action changes anything. The Stoics rejected this fantasy entirely. They believed time reveals, not repairs. Only disciplined actions repairs. This is where Stoicism begins to look demanding, because it insists that you face consequences early while they're still manageable. It says, correct now or correct later under pressure. There is no third option. Most people choose later, not consciously, by doing nothing. Stoicism calls that choice out. Inaction is action. It produces results too, just rarely the ones you want. The Stoic understands that consequence is neutral. It doesn't judge you. It doesn't hate you. It simply reflects your patterns. This understanding changes how you see failure. Failure stops being humiliating. It becomes information. What pattern produced this? What assumption was wrong? What needs to change structurally? No drama, no self-hate, just correction. This is why Stoics don't spiral after setbacks. They analyze. They don't ask, why does this always happen to me? They ask, what did I repeatedly do that made this likely? That question restores control. Not control over everything, control over what matters. Your behavior, This is also where Stoicism clashes with modern emotional culture. Modern culture encourages expression. Stoicism encourages examination. Expression without examination creates noise. Examination without expression creates clarity. The Stoic chooses clarity, and clarity brings uncomfortable realizations. You start seeing patterns in your relationships, why the same conflicts repeat, why the same disappointments appear. It's not bad luck, it's tolerance. You tolerated avoiding boundaries. You tolerated misalignment. You tolerated discomfort instead of confronting it. Consequences follow tolerance. Stoicism teaches you to lower tolerance for what weakens you, not aggressively, firmly. This firmness changes how people treat you. You stop negotiating your standards. You stop over-explaining. You stop accepting excuses from yourself and others. This can feel isolating. People who benefited from your tolerance won't like the change. Stoicism prepares you for this too. It teaches that approval is fragile and not worth trading stability for, because stability outlasts popularity. Now here's where consequence becomes existential. Time amplifies it. A year of misalignment is uncomfortable. A decade is devastating. The Stoics were acutely aware of this. They didn't fear death emotionally. They respected it logically, not because they were morbid, because death clarifies priority. It removes imaginary timelines. It exposes delay. You don't suddenly change at 40 or 50 or someday. You become gradually what you practice. That realization makes procrastination terrifying, not in a panicked way, in a sobering way. Stoicism doesn't rush you, but it refuses to let you drift. It constantly asks, is this action moving you toward who you respect or away from it? That question is unforgiving, and that's why Stoicism produces strong opinions. It says self-respect matters more than comfort. It says long-term consequence matters more than short-term feeling. It says responsibility is not optional. These ideas collide with a culture that prioritizes ease and expression. And that collision creates tension. Some people feel judged by Stoicism. Others feel liberated. The difference lies in this. If you want permission to stay the same, Stoicism will feel cruel. If you want the tools to change, Stoicism will feel honest. But here's the twist. Even after you accept consequence, even after you correct behavior, even after you build discipline, there is still something that can undo everything. Ego, not arrogance. Identity, the story you tell yourself about who you are. That story can either support growth or sabotage it quietly. And that's where the next block goes. Because Stoicism doesn't just discipline action, it dismantles identity. And that's the most painful work of all. Identity is the last refuge of resistance. You can change habits, you can change routines, you can even change behavior. But if identity stays untouched, everything eventually snaps back. Because identity whispers quietly, "That's not who you are." Stoicism understands this danger. That's why it doesn't ask you to feel like a different person. It asks you to act like one until the story rewrites itself. Most people do the opposite. They build a story first. I'm disciplined now. I'm strong now. I've changed. Then reality tests that story. Stress hits. Fatigue arrives. Something goes wrong. And the old identity resurfaces. I've always been like this. I'm just not built for consistency. This is who I am. Stoicism dismantles this entire structure. It says identity is not something you discover. It's something you earn. And you earn it through repetition, not through declarations, not through intention, through evidence. Every time you act according to your standards, you cast a vote, not for an outcome, for an identity. And identities built on evidence are hard to break. The Stoics warned against something they called self-narration, the habit of constantly explaining yourself to yourself, why you reacted, why you failed, why you deserve an exception. This narration feels harmless. It's not. It softens responsibility. It turns correction into comfort. Stoicism interrupts this. It reduces the inner dialogue, not by silencing thought, but by shortening it. Instead of stories, there are assessments. Action aligned, action misaligned. Adjust tomorrow. No drama, no self-concept crisis, just feedback. This is deeply unsettling for people whose identity is built on emotion. Because once you stop narrating, there's nothing to hide behind. You're confronted with behavior as it is, and behavior doesn't care how you see yourself. This is why Stoicism often feels like ego death. You can no longer rely on labels. I'm an anxious person. I'm a creative type. I'm not disciplined by nature. Stoicism treats these labels as irrelevant. They explain nothing. They fix nothing. The only thing that matters is what you do next. This approach terrifies people who rely on identity for stability, because identity becomes a shelter, a place to hide from effort. Stoicism removes the shelter, not to expose you to pain, but to force growth. Once identity stops protecting you, you're free to change, not emotionally free, practically free. You stop defending who you were and start building who you are becoming. This shift is subtle. You don't announce it. You don't post about it. You simply stop making exceptions. Exceptions are where identity hides. Just this once. I deserve this. It won't matter. Stoicism treats exceptions with suspicion, not because life must be rigid, but because exceptions accumulate. One exception becomes a pattern becomes character. The Stoic asks, is this exception strengthening me or weakening me? That question is uncomfortable because the answer is usually clear. And clarity removes excuses. This is where Stoicism becomes isolating. You can no longer bond over shared weakness. Complaining feels pointless. Venting feels indulgent. Not because emotion disappears, but because it no longer dictates behavior. You listen, you acknowledge, you act anyway. People may mistake this for coldness. Stoicism doesn't care. It values effectiveness over appearance. This brings us to another difficult truth. Most people secretly want their identity to limit them. It gives them an exit. I'm just not like that. I'm not wired for consistency. I've always struggled with this. Stoicism rejects this entirely. It says, you struggle because you practice struggling. You are inconsistent because you rehearse inconsistency. This isn't condemnation, it's explanation, and explanations can be changed. The Stoics believed that the mind is shaped more by what it tolerates than by what it intends. If you tolerate distraction, you become distracted. If you tolerate excuses, you become unreliable. If you tolerate weakness, you become fragile. Tolerance is training, and training shapes identity. This is why Stoicism emphasizes boundaries, not emotional boundaries, behavioral ones. What you allow into your day, what you allow into your mind, what behavior you refuse to normalize. These boundaries are not about control. They're about protection, protection of attention, protection of energy, protection of alignment. Once identity is no longer your shield, standards become your anchor. You don't ask who you are, you ask what you do. And what you do repeatedly answers the question for you. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel Stoic Freedom